Hello everyone and welcome to every episode of the Fairly Odd Parents Season 9, Part 1, Reviewed. Yeah, you're probably wondering why only half the season is being reviewed in this video. It's because I lost the files for the slide layouts during production, which set this video back further than it should have been. If I didn't cut this video in half, you'd all probably be waiting weeks to months before the full thing came out. And since it's been about a year since Season 7 and 8 came out, I really didn't want to make all of you wait that much longer for Season 9. So I've decided to make it into two parts. You'll get half the episodes in this one, and sometime in the future you'll get the other half. So, without further ado, let's get into the reviews. Episode 127, Fairly Odd Pet. Timmy tries to get a new pet and ends up with a magical dog named Sparky. Everyone knows that when this episode came out, it had to win fans over. Great, they're adding another new character with the new season. It's something that they tried twice before, and it really does show with this episode. A lot of this episode feels like formula establishing. We have to be introduced to the new character, and then they have to cause the conflict, and then they have to win over the main cast in the end. All that to say, with this episode they really had to try to sell the concept of Sparky to fans, and I don't think they did a good job. Right off the bat, we're shown this fairy pet store, where Sparky then says that he's had 83 previous owners, and according to the photo album we're shown, all of his previous owners had been adults, which shouldn't know fairies exist. There's a lot of little plot flubs like that in the episode that suggest there was no proofreading involved. First, there's an E.T. reference where Timmy leaps in front of the moon, and the episode then explains why this was a stupid joke in the very next line, because the shots before and after the scene were during the day. Just animate the rest of the scene at night if you want to make that joke. There's also a moment where Sparky digs the house underground, where Timmy then asks Cosmo and Wanda to poof it back, which they do, but then a few scenes later, and they can't grant a wish because their wands are underground. And how they get their wands back at the end is an even weirder thing, because they kind of just appear for no reason. But even without all that, let's say they clean up the writing errors. I still think they would have done a bad job of selling us the concept of this character, because up until Timmy watches that DVD of the things they've done together, which I'll talk more about later, yeah, up until then, the only emotion we've seen Timmy feel towards Sparky is annoyance. The only emotion I have felt is annoyance up to this point. And so when Timmy watches that DVD, which by the way, should only contain moments from the episode because he's only had Sparky for a day and we've seen pretty much everything that's happened. When Timmy watches it, he does a complete 180 emotionally and is not believable at all. If it wasn't already obvious, it's a bad episode. If the raw emotions played out naturally based on the events in the episode, the characters should want Sparky gone, because that's what the audience wants. But I don't think that's what they were going for, and that's a failure to write a story where the emotions make sense. Episode 128A, Dinkle Scouts. Mr. Dinkleberg becomes the scout leader for Timmy's Squirrely Scout group. When it comes to episodes teaching lessons, there's two ways they can usually fail. They can either teach a good lesson in a bad way, or they could just flat out teach a bad lesson. This episode teaches a bad lesson. The lesson that Timmy's supposed to learn in this episode is that it's okay to put irresponsible people in positions of power, effectively putting himself and everyone else in danger, just for the sake of not hurting his dad's feelings. The entire episode, we're supposed to feel sorry for Mr. Turner, but it's very unearned, especially when the episode explicitly mentions that he almost got Timmy and the other Squirrely Scouts killed. The wrong character comes out on top in this episode. In this episode, it feels good when Mr. Turner gets put in his place, and they take it all away just so they can emotionally manipulate the viewer. It's nasty, it's underhanded, and it makes this episode bad. (128B) I Dream of Cosmo. Cosmo hits his head and thinks he must be a genie that has to grant Mr. Turner's wishes. I wonder how much I can even say about this one. This episode might just be the most bare bones a Fairly Odd Parents episode can be. I mean, for starters, the episode doesn't even really have a conflict until a 1 minute long span near the end of the episode, where the sun just gets closer to Earth. That same thing happened in Just Desserts, by the way. Yeah, when they finally do get around to having a conflict in this episode, it just ends up being a similar conflict to one we saw in a previous episode. There's also some dumb moments like Timmy and Wanda getting shrunk, which has definitely happened before in King Chang, and they pull out lore in this episode that definitely contradicts those previous times this happened, doing so just so they can force a problem in the plot. I warned against this in seasons 7 and 8. If they keep haphazardly adding lore, they'll just contradict themselves. They've done it here, and that's really all they do of note. You know, it's interesting how they felt they needed to add this character in, Sparky, that no one asked for, but yet the only 2 episodes so far outside of his debut appearance have both been about Mr. Turner, who was definitely overused in Season 7. I'm not asking for Sparky to be the protagonist of every episode, but why even add a character no one wanted if you're not going to justify his existence by using him? Well, I don't know if it specifically would have made this episode better anyway. It's a
bad episode,
with or without Sparky heavily in the plot. 129A, Turner and Pooch. Mr. Crocker detects new magic at Timmy's house and searches for its source. And guys, I was struggling to come up with a synopsis. This is the first episode where I can genuinely say nothing happens. Like, I thought Farm Pit was bad in that regard, and heck, even both episodes have the crutch of Cosmo and Wanda not having their wands, which is so overused at this point. Like, guys, you've got to come up with something else, but nope, they just decide that it's the only plot point they're gonna have in this episode. Like, Crocker's searches for Sparky is so basic and bare bones that without the necessary jokes, there's really not a story to be had. I thought last episode was bare bones, and this just takes it to another level. There were 2 moments where I sort of chuckled, and they were Crocker getting run over and Cosmo's spatula joke. That's it. And that first one comes with the caveat that they use that joke twice in the episode, and not in a running gag way, but more of a we forgot that we did this earlier way. Outside of that, nothing happens in this episode.
It's a bad episode.
The bads already seem to be piling up, and we're very early in this season. Just through 4 episodes, the season already has as many bad episodes as Season 4. It's just, even the voice actors sound tired and not like they're giving their full effort in this one. I honestly feel bad that they got roped into doing this, just because they did an audition all the way back in 2001. And that ending is one of the weakest I've ever seen. As all Timmy has to do is throw a pair of dice and everything goes back to normal. Next episode. 129B, Dumbbell Curve. Timmy wishes for everyone to become dumber than him. I gotta say, this was a pleasant surprise. Just from what the episode was about, I was not expecting it to be very engaging, or have a plot that makes any kind of sense. But somehow, they threaded the needle and they managed to at least be pretty funny with it. There's a couple of pretty good running gags, like the hot dogs and Crocker's special effects never working, and in addition to jokes, this story was actually surprisingly good. I've seen shows try the everyone becomes stupid story before, and a lot of the time it just evolves into straight up mental retardation. If you want an example of that, just look at Salsa and Basilicus from SpongeBob. This is that episode done right, in my opinion. And why it works is, instead of making everyone completely brain dead, they're all just mild versions of Cosmo, which makes their stupidity a lot more easy to stomach. I did find myself scratching my head at them stealing the exact conflict from Pipe Down, and also, Sparky gets like 2 tiny scenes, and his sole purpose in them is to tell a joke that not only isn't funny, but also completely sucks whatever momentum they had out of the current scene. Sparky hasn't really done much since his debut episode, and the times he has been there have been shoehorned in just to justify his existence. But the character himself is just a black hole that sucks away any comedy from the scene he's in. It's a sign that they shouldn't have added him to the show. But even with those things I didn't like, there were enough things here that I did like that I can, by the slightest margins, call this episode good. 130A, The Terrible Twosome. Poof reaches a phase called the Terrible Twos, and tries to freeze Earth. This episode suffers from a lack of clarity. I mean, there's already not much going on in this episode, and I could see them trying to make the climax big and epic, but throughout you really never feel like much is happening, even when the Earth is freezing over. This lack of clarity is the worst with how Poof's terrible twos are explained. Timmy is supposed to not age in this show, and so in every episode he's 10 years old, aside from Birthday Bashed, and even in that episode, it's clear that the continuity doesn't make much sense, and doesn't tie to the rest of the show. So then why has Poof aged 2 years since his first appearance? Unless the terrible twos are just something that arbitrarily happens. Especially because an entire season goes by between the birth of Poof and Foop, and yet they're 2 years old at the exact same time. But in the episode, they also say that this phase only lasts 12 hours, and is unaffected by magic. 2 things they just added in haphazardly just because. They keep giving themselves handicaps so the plot can't quickly be resolved with Timmy wishing things away, I get that, but also, if you do that in every episode, it's very clear what you're doing. But since they don't really clearly explain the state Poof is in, it's really hard to care about what's going on in the episode. It's not necessarily bad, but it's just incomprehensible, and for that reason, it's an okay episode. All I'm asking is that you clearly define the rules for these new lore things you add to the show. When you keep adding new characters to the show and new rules for how the magic system works, episodes become fuzzy when you don't explain what happens when these things interact. Especially when you insist on adding new characters that only get a couple of lines at the beginning of the episode, and take a backseat to the two you added in the previous seasons. Just keep track of how these things interact. 130B, App Trap. Timmy wishes for a cool smartphone that eventually tries to destroy his social life. First of all, I have to say, you might be surprised, but there are some little comedic moments in this episode that I did like. Cosmo's running gag about his phone being a soup can was something I didn't expect to be done so well. It's a running gag, but they vary it up each time they use it, and so it's not like those running gags where they just say a word or phrase repeatedly throughout the episode. That was rather funny. Also, the virtual Cosmo comparing and contrasting jeans and cocktail dresses was also a chuckle-worthy moment. There are other attempts at jokes in the episode, like the ending gag, but I wasn't all that impressed with it. As far as story goes, this episode is really just a better version of Superbike. The new overpowered device wants Timmy to itself, and so it goes to great lengths to make that happen. What elevates this one over Superbike is that you don't have the forced guilt element in the story, and so the conflict is free to just be the conflict. Especially in times like this, it's nice to see them cover the topic of artificial intelligence taking over the world, even if, in certain aspects, the execution of the story wasn't that great. I mean, it's nice that Sparky's involved in the story and that he gets lines around the time of the conflict of the episode, but what's somewhat tainted by the crutch they're using a lot of the season of not having Cosmo and Wanda's magic work for some contrived reason. Honestly, if it weren't for that, I'd give them props for having a story that mimics the spirit of the early seasons, where Timmy wishes for something and that thing's unintended consequences drive the conflict. That too was also tainted by the fact that it never comes as a surprise that Chatty ends up being evil though, because it's pretty much stated in the scene where Chatty is introduced, just Timmy doesn't notice. So with all the good aspects and all the bad aspects piling up in pretty much equal numbers, this episode rounds out to an okay. Episode 131A, Force of Nature. Timmy uses animals to clean up trash. I have to say, you don't think they can keep coming up with creative ideas 9 seasons in, and while some of the episodes this season have been derivative, this one seems fresh. I like that the idea behind this episode is one that makes sense for Timmy, and one that really does keep you engaged throughout. It does have the stupid crutch of Cosmo and Wanda not having their wands again, but at this point, I think it's more notable to point out when it doesn't happen than when it does. Sparky only getting a couple of lines at the beginning is a double-edged sword, because while I don't like Sparky as a character, and I think he's very unfunny, you added this character to the show, now you barely use him because you don't even think he adds much to the show. Aside from that, as far as jokes, I think the Crocker stuff at the beginning was pretty funny. Standard Crocker is an idiot jokes, and they did make me laugh. It's weird how you think Crocker is going to have a bigger role in the story, and then he just disappears from it halfway through, though. The animals also trying to get rid of Timmy by assuming he dislikes the same things they do was also a pretty clever and funny joke. Yeah, there's quite a bit of positive aspects to this episode, and the negatives aren't really that bad, so yeah, it's a good episode. 131B, Viral Vidiots. Mr. Crocker kidnaps Mrs. Turner after believing she's a breakfast troll. I had a tough time figuring out what to rate this episode, because on one hand, it does have some pretty funny moments. Cosmo's running gag of watching paint dry and then getting hit by a wall is pretty funny, and Mr. Turner gets some good moments in here as well. Really, the main problem with the episode is that it's just kind of boring at points. The story can't really figure out what it wants to be, and as a result, I wasn't really able to stay engaged. I like the callbacks to Mrs. Turner as a bad cook. They do give some variation, so it's not completely the same as what we've seen before. But there's really not much to keep this from being an okay episode. It's not terrible, but I don't think they took the concept to its fullest potential. It's like they had some ideas but couldn't really mesh them together into one thing. I'll give them credit that they're at least trying to be funny, but there really does seem to be a hard ceiling on how good these episodes can be, since they insist on heavily utilizing cliches that are real problems. Once again, Sparky only shows up so they can say they used him and to justify his existence. Once again, there's a shoehorned in reason that Cosmo and Wanda can't use their wands. Just a bunch of little things like that that only make episodes worse, not better. 132, Scary God Couple. Foop becomes Vicky's fairy godparent and grants Vicky's evil wishes. I don't really know what to talk about first with this one. Maybe I could talk about how stupid it is that Foop gets a fairy godchild as a child. I could talk about how it's weird that anti-fairies can even have godchildren despite no evidence that it was ever possible before. I could talk about how the title card and even the title of the episode makes it seem a lot more disturbing and fanfiction-y than what the episode actually is. I could talk about how the episode is a pretty blatant ripoff of When Losers Attack. All of those would be valid criticisms, and yet I'm still not sure you'd get the full effect. This episode strikes a hilarious combination between boring and stupid. Pretty much nothing happens for the first part of the episode, and yet there's all these little things that build into me not liking this episode. Of course it's a
Bad episode.
The only thing I really liked were the scenes where Mr. Turner is clearly having a good time but has to act like he's hating it. Obviously, a couple of good moments here and there don't save this episode, and there's even a scene where they rip off Phineas and Ferb. Like, blatantly. They just turn Candace into Vicky. If that was a slight at Phineas and Ferb, it wasn't a good one, because it wasn't really conveyed that that's what they were doing, so the whole thing looks like an oversight instead of being seen as intentional. Overall, this episode was just not good, and I struggle to understand how the storytelling blunders from Fairly OddPet made a return here. They were doing alright for a while, and with this episode, that progress was wiped away. 133A, 2.5 Babies. Poof and Foop take care of an egg for a school project. You know, I think this episode might have had some things going for it in the concept stage, but really, when you boil it down, no pun intended, this episode comes off as incredibly cliched, and not well thought out. The story here is incredibly light, as it doesn't seem to have a real central conflict. Yes, they're trying to keep the egg from being destroyed, but when the egg actually does get destroyed in the episode, it's such a non-event, and I think that's because they don't really build up anything in this episode at all. I get that what they were doing was a story that's already been done quite a bit, but you still have to do something and not just use a stock storyline to its basics. A much better story would be to have Foop destroy the egg early in the episode, and the rest of the episode is about him trying to hide that fact from everyone else. With the episode we got, it just feels so unfocused, and they don't really add any funny jokes. I get that they were trying, but I feel like they thought that the jokes they used in the episode were a lot funnier than they really were. And I know they haven't forgotten about how to be funny, because they have done it in this season before.
It's a bad episode.
It's on the lighter side, but with how sloppy the story was, and how confusing the character dynamics were, it just left a lot to be desired. And also, Sparky isn't in this one, basically confirming that he could have been written out of most of his appearances so far, and not much would change. Hell, it also confirms it was a bad idea to have him in the show in the first place, but you've already heard me rant about that enough. 133B, Anchors Away. Chet You Betcha stops being a news anchor after Timmy unwishes things before he can report on them. While you think it'd be bad for an episode to be derivative, I don't really mind it in this case. This episode is like a combination of Mother Nature and Kindred Spirits. Neither of those episodes were good, but for whatever reason I find that what those episodes do actually works in this case. Because here, Timmy isn't knowingly doing anything wrong towards Chet You Betcha and actually tries to fix his problem anyway. And Mr. Turner is oblivious to all of it, so it actually ends up being pretty funny. This might even be Mr. Turner's best appearance in Season 9 so far. I really like the women's size 4 joke and just how incompetent he is at being a news anchor, and some vague observational jokes dealing with that, such as Mr. Turner being too important to know the cameraman's name. This episode is a bit slow, but honestly I'll take it when they give me nice jokes, and they explore a character that doesn't really get much time solely focused on him. It's a good episode, even though its plot was a combination of an okay and a bad episode. Sometimes they can redeem themselves, I guess. Episode 134A, Finding Emo. Timmy changes personalities multiple times to impress a girl. We already kind of had an episode like this in Emotion Commotion. That was in Season 4, a season famous for having a lot of good episodes that were really close to being okay. This, however, is a
Bad episode.
that's really close to being okay. I suppose we should start with Timmy in this episode. Immediately, I don't really care if he wins in this episode. Why? Because he doesn't seem to care, and he takes almost no convincing to wish himself back to normal. Now, you might ask, isn't most of the episode spent trying to get him to wish himself back? Yes, you'd be right about that, but the problem is it doesn't really matter when there isn't any kind of transitional state. He's just nihilistic for a huge part of the episode, and then he enthusiastically wishes himself back to normal in a tone of voice that indicates he's already back to normal, when nothing pivotal has actually happened to change his state of mind. Yeah, you could argue this girl did, but she's the reason he made this wish in the first place, and a lot of the episode is spent with him not even pursuing her. And this love interest has no personality herself. Maybe that's why she was so malleable to have Timmy wish himself into a few different personalities in the episode. But Timmy already had a love interest that has been mentioned by name this season. She didn't appear, but Trixie Tang was at least in the minds of the makers of this show when Season 9 was made. It's just jarring that she's not here because they absolutely could have done this episode with Trixie Tang. As the episode is, it's not terrible, and it was close to okay because there were aspects that I liked, such as a few of the scenes before Timmy turned emo, but after that point there really isn't much in this episode that's good. Episode 134B, Dustbusters. Fairy dust contaminates everything in the Turner's house. This might just be the most nonsensical story I've seen in Season 9 so far. I mean, you have this fairy dust, which has never seemed to be an issue until 13 years into this show's run, and all of a sudden, it's this huge issue that's going to make the house explode? From the very beginning, the story is hard to stomach, and of course, it seems like it was explicitly written so Turner couldn't make any wishes, as one more wish and the house explodes. But the house explodes anyway, even after a second-order attempt by the writers to take Cosmo and Wanda's wands away, as they can't use them because of the fairy dust, but then when the situation is dire, oh well, they got sucked up by the vacuum cleaner. And even as the house explodes, Timmy just wishes up a new one, which means the entire catalyst for the conflict didn't really matter, as the one thing they said couldn't happen happened and it was no big deal. And also, let's talk about this containment device. You don't think after 9 seasons Mr. and Mrs. Turner wouldn't notice this huge metal thing in their basement after they have no idea where it came from? I know they're stupid, but even that is a bit much to be believable.
It's a bad episode.
Just nothing that happens makes sense, and they keep using that crutch of Cosmo and Wanda's wands when they have no other ideas for conflict. Episode 135A, The Board Identity. Mr. Turner's drive to take Timmy to school turns into an action-packed spy movie. You'd think after the times they've tried to do stories similar to this, it would get old, but Double O Schnozmo was boring. Odd Jobs and Action Packed were good episodes, but this episode does go in a different enough direction that I'm okay with them covering a topic they've already done a few times in the past. What sets this apart is the set pieces. The conflict is technically being resolved by Timmy going along and making his dad think that he's doing more interesting things, when he was really the one behind it all the time. It's that kind of wholesome driving to a plot that seriously has been lacking lately. While the first few minutes of this episode are as boring as Mr. Turner is made out to be at the beginning, when the episode picks up, it really picks up. We see Mr. Turner do all kinds of stunts and various things that are really cool to watch, and they didn't spare us the jokes either. Mr. Crocker getting run over, the various tools Mr. Turner uses to perform surgery, Mrs. Turner confusing her husband for potting soil, and Sparky forgetting his lines were all notable jokes in the episode. It's not the funniest episode in the world, but after listing off all the jokes, it's not lacking either. I think it's a good episode, and I'm really a sucker for any episode that explores the side of Mr. Turner that lacks self-esteem, because it gives him vulnerabilities instead of having him be one-dimensional and only in the show for jokes. Episode 135B, Country Clubbed. When Timmy's parents are invited to a country club, he tries to keep them on their best behavior. I initially didn't know how to feel about this one. It actually is sufficiently funny, with the funniest joke probably being Remy using his butler to write his essay about the Titanic, which is actually a layered joke because for one, Crocker doesn't suspect anything, and also the joke is that he was actually there. Things like Cosmo's prophecy and the quote I used for this slide were also worthy of a mention, and there's even a few other things in the episode that I at least mildly thought were funny. But aside from jokes, the episode, I'll admit, does have a really messy story. There's a scene in the middle of the episode where they go back to Timmy's room after he gets kicked out, and nothing happens in that scene, which is a bit of a problem, because there's an entire subplot that could be written out of the episode entirely. It doesn't add much to the episode, it doesn't connect to the rest of the episode, it's not funny, and it doesn't get resolved. I'm of course talking about the brain-swapping machine that opens the episode. I mean, the main story can't even get itself straight on what it wants to be about, and they decided to add a subplot that doesn't add much. Sure, that makes sense. But despite my complaints about the story, I was still conflicted on which side of the good-okay line this episode fell. In the end, I gave the episode a good, just barely, by the skin of its teeth. I think the jokes here are funnier than most of what we've seen this season, and what put it over the edge for me is the fact that we get Remy Bucksaplenty in this episode, which, considering how other secondary and tertiary characters have been treated, is something to be celebrated. Some fan-favorite characters will never be seen again, and it's just unfortunate, so you have to be glad when they actually use one as the focal point of an episode. Although, with all the rich snobby people at this country club, Doug Dimmadome couldn't even get a mention? Come on, guys. Episode 136A, Doggone. After Sparky saves Mr. Ledley's life, Mr. Ledley tries to buy him. This is just a dumb story, all the way through, and it really highlights a weakness of Sparky as a character that could have been alleviated if they just thought things through in his first appearance. Since I've watched that episode, nothing in any of his subsequent appearances has clearly defined whether he's like any other fairy, that is, allowed to be in the presence of adult humans. Maybe it's okay if they don't know he's a fairy dog, but they don't really state it. And since the idea of fairy pets was added so late into the show, and since every other rule of how this world works is so clearly defined, it was always going to look really weird when you decide to not explain one thing in a show where the rules are clearly defined. And with this episode in particular, since it deals so heavily with Sparky and Mr. Turner, it's a real problem with the episode. Mr. Turner grows attached to this dog, and it's not even clear what his understanding of this dog even is. And with how ridiculous Timmy's solution is, basically telling him to poof back even though Mr. Ledley would pretty much immediately know Sparky is gone and start torturing Mr. Turner again, we're right back at square one. And the ending is also pretty weak. Mr. Ledley just gives Sparky back to Mr. Turner because Mr. Turner was the first person to stand up to him, which just makes the whole episode feel like a waste.
It's a bad episode.
Episode 136B, Turner Back Time. Timmy wishes his ancestor was a railroad tycoon. I'm gonna spare you guys any kind of build-up. This is a
Bad episode.
Now, it's not the worst one I've talked about in this series so far, but it is the episode with the most problems of any episode I've talked about. I mean, let's start with the concept. This episode borrows heavily from quite a few episodes. There's the needing to do a history report from Twistery. There's the founding of Dimsdale from Which Witch is Which. There's the lack of understanding of the value of life from It's a Wishful Life. There's the memory erasure from Secret Origin of Denzel Crocker. And there's even the changing timeline of ancestors from Timmy Turnip. And while none of those episodes had a majority of their plot stolen by this one, they still mess around with concepts here in a way that doesn't put together a good story. Timmy still gets his fairies taken away because he doesn't need them anymore because he's rich. But then explain Remy Bucksaplenty, literally a character that appeared a couple of episodes ago. The fact that that character exists destroys any chance of this story working. Well, I'm sorry, it destroys this story's chance of working if you don't explain anything further than Timmy's rich. His parents' personalities didn't change, so they're still the same neglectful parents they were before, and so what's the workaround for that? It just doesn't work how I think they intended, and as a result, it's distracting for pretty much the entire time you're watching. And also, there's some little stupid things I didn't mention, like the fact that Dimsdale's entire power supply is dependent on one single on-off button, or the fact that Timmy goes back in time to before railroads even existed, but there's such a thing as a railroad tycoon. Yeah, couldn't even bother to do that one quick Google search. Episode 137A, Cosmonopoly. Mr. Turner gets trapped in a board game made by Cosmo. I'm not really sure how this happened. This episode is a masterpiece. A lot of the other good episodes so far have been borderline okay episodes that were saved by maybe one or two moments, but this is fun all the way through. From the very beginning, there's some really genuinely funny moments, like Mrs. Turner firing up the wood chipper exactly when Cosmo mentions that it couldn't happen, or Sparky selling Mr. Crocker's own wallet back to him. Then we get into this board game, and all the tropes that play with the idea of a board game are present and used in really creative ways. They did use the crutch of not making the wands functional, but since it's used here as a joke and not really as a plot point, it's not that bad. And as we go through this board game and you see all these creative ideas, it starts to get revealed that the board game is based on how Cosmo and Wanda met, which is a nice through line to the whole thing. This was the most enjoyable watch of Season 9 so far, and while I doubt they'd be able to top it, I sure do hope I'm proven wrong. It's obviously a good episode, and really the only one up to this point in Season 9 that I consider really good. 137B, Hero Hound. Sparky feels useless, so Timmy puts himself in danger just so Sparky can save his life. The ultimate idea of this episode is something I could definitely see working, but this episode is lacking in execution. The story kind of meanders along with each action that happens, not really feeling consequential, and the jokes in between those actions aren't really good either. That results in this episode pretty much just being boring for its entirety. I get they're trying to do something with Sparky's character, but when the episode doesn't really hold my attention, you're not exactly doing that. I mean, how many times has an episode shoved Sparky on the screen for 5 seconds just so he can say 1 or 2 lines, and never be in the episode after that? And when they finally give him his own episode, it's one that has a slow-moving plot that doesn't know what it wants to do. They're not exactly doing a good job of justifying this character that they insisted on adding to the show. It's an okay episode. While there's not really anything good about this one, I didn't notice any glaring problems that infuriated me. It's just kind of a dull episode. Episode 138A. A Boy and His Dog Boy. Sparky becomes a human, and so, to balance the dog-human continuum, Timmy becomes a dog. I just don't get this one. This is one of the few times where I've been left genuinely speechless. I mean, they ripped off a pretty terrible episode from Season 1 with this one, but you know, it's kind of better than that. I mean, it is pretty easy to be a better episode than Dog's Day Afternoon, but they also seem to not remember that episode. I guess it isn't surprising, though. When you really think about it, The Fairly Odd Parents the show has stopped caring about the way its universe has been set up a long time ago. We didn't hear about the dog-human continuum the first time Timmy turned into a dog. Now, yes, it did come with a dog equivalently swapping places with Timmy, but you can't just make these kinds of things up after you've already done a similar story. And the way they go about explaining it is so lackadaisical. The episode just says, this is a thing, and then it becomes a thing. And even though it's set up like a joke, it's used as a crucial plot point in the episode. And also, Timmy can talk as a dog in this one, but couldn't the last time he was a dog. I suppose it's not as bad of an episode, and there's nothing really frustrating, but man, it's clear that with the way the story is set up, they didn't think at all that just maybe they had already done something similar. It's an okay episode, very close to being bad, but I don't think it quite hits that mark. Episode 138B, Croc Blocked. Timmy wishes for Mr. Crocker to disappear. Wow, that title. You know, this episode shows the strengths of a character like Mr. Crocker. The best jokes you can tell with him are to show him being a pathetic loser, but also an evil one, and seeing him get tortured. That's the entire setup to this. I mean, they really do establish just how bothersome Crocker is in pursuit of Timmy's fairies, even to the point of being creepy, which just adds to his patheticness. He invades Timmy's home multiple times, including his bathroom, which they missed on a joke about calling the toilet the crock pot, but I digress. His home invasions end with him getting bludgeoned and then run over multiple times, and it ends with him being repeatedly stepped on by a football team. So we see some catharsis out of seeing this evil character have some slapstick applied to him, and slapstick is one thing, but it's slapstick done right. Crocker reacts in pain every time something happens to him, so we get the effect that he is really being hurt by all these things happening to him. I'll grant that the magic in this episode is kind of stupid. Like, even Timmy himself brings up that how the wish is granted isn't what he meant. And also, the ending gag is just not funny. It's so overdone, and it also goes a bit too far even for it to be believable with Mr. Crocker. Even with those problems aside, with how engaging the story is thanks to the slapstick, I do consider this episode to be good. So, that was Season 9, Part 1 reviewed. I'm not going to do a pie chart or give a rating for this because it's not a natural division of Season 9. It's just where I decided to cut it off because it's roughly the halfway point of the season. As I really just wanted to get this out so that I could have something out and you guys not have to wait weeks or months for the entire video to come out due to me losing the slide files. So, I hope you enjoyed Part 1, stay tuned for Part 2, and have a good one.